My name is Raj Vancia, and I am one of the TAs for CS6440, and today we'll be going over SMART on FHIR. So for today's session, some of the learning objectives include: you'll get a basic understanding of what SMART on FHIR is, you'll learn why it's important in the field and why we're using it in the class, and at the end, I'll show you a tutorial of how to set up your own app with a sandbox environment. We'll be using two sandbox environments. One is the Cerner sandbox, and we'll be also using SMART on FHIR's own sandbox environment. So the SMART in SMART on FHIR stands for Substitutable Medical Reusable Technology. Substitutable basically means that you could use different third-party apps, and you could choose what works best for you. SMART was developed in around 2010, and it came out of the Boston Children's Medical Hospital as well as the Harvard Medical School. SMART is a set of standards that allows different third-party apps to integrate and authenticate within the EHR. And one of the advantages of SMART is that it could be used across different platforms, such as Cerner and Epic. Some of the open standards that it utilizes include OAuth 2 for authentication, and for identity management, it uses OpenID Connect. This allows for the user to sign in and provide some context, such as their NPI number or other basic demographic information. SMART also provides some robust client libraries using common programming language such as JavaScript, Python, and iOS. It utilizes modern web technologies and can be used to develop both web and mobile apps. And one of the main advantages of using SMART is that it can be directly embedded within EHRs. This greatly helps support better workflow integration for providers. Before we get into the details of SMART on FHIR, I'll show you what are some existing apps that are already out there using this technology. I highly recommend you to explore these apps within the app library on SMART on FHIR's main website. This will give you a better understanding on how these apps are used in a wide range of different use cases. This library includes both commercial and open source applications. So now launch the SMART on FHIR app gallery. You can see the different types of apps, such as one geared towards population health, risk calculation, and data visualization. Next, we'll be exploring one of the SMART on FHIR apps, the bilirubin chart. Here we could get a quick synopsis of what this app is about. Today we are going to be testing out the bilirubin app. This app can help calculate a patient's risk for hyperbilirubinemia. It's intended to help prevent jaundice in newborns. So when we click on Try App, it will launch the simulated EHR. So as this is a provider-facing app, we're going to be using the practitioner logon. Now select your patient. So now the data is presented both in tabular and in chart form. It clearly shows a risk calculation based on the bilirubin levels and the postnatal age. The different colors represents the different risk levels, and you can see how this patient fares. As you can see from the short example that we just went over, you can understand now why SMART on FHIR is being adopted widely within the industry. It helps try to solve the interoperability problem with the ideal goal of having a rich set of ecosystem of apps that can be used in multiple healthcare systems and on top of different EHR vendors. And SMART is not just for clinicians. There are also apps geared towards patients, which allows them to view their medical data. This helps with patient engagement and allows the patients to be more involved with their healthcare. Also, one of the big pushes for the adoption of SMART on FHIR is that it helps fulfill the requirement for Meaningful Use 3. MU3 is one of CMS's policy that requires organizations to provide patients with access to their healthcare data. Lastly, it provides clinicians with more options on what types of apps they can use, so they're not locked in to only what their main EMR vendor can provide. So we'll be using SMART within the class and throughout your projects. It helps provide a common platform for showcasing your apps. And also, a lot of your mentors work in healthcare systems that are already using SMART. Working with SMART on FHIR in the class helps demonstrate some real-world use cases. Also, while you're developing your app for your project, SMART on FHIR provides some robust client libraries, which makes it a lot easier to retrieve data from the FHIR server. Below is the basic OAuth workflow for the app that you are going to be testing out. The app makes a request to the FHIR server to get what the authorization URL server is. The app then sends an authorization request to the auth server with some of the context parameters such as the patient ID and what type of resources it wants to access. Once validated, the authorization server sends back an authorization code. This code can then be exchanged with an access token. Once the app has that access token, it can then make FHIR resource calls against the FHIR server. However, it can only access the patient that is in context and to FHIR resources defined by the access token. Cerner, being one of the top EHR vendors, has provided a sandbox environment to test SMART on FHIR apps for developers. So for this first tutorial, I will show you how to get set up with the Cerner sandbox environment and deploy your first app. Some of the requirements include you'll need access to GitHub pages or a hosting platform such as Heroku, and you will also need a Cerner Care account, which is free. You can access the tutorial using the link provided. Cerner has provided a tutorial and sample code to get your first SMART on FHIR app running on their Cerner sandbox environment. Next, go to the GitHub page and fork their tutorial. Once you fork the tutorial to your own GitHub page, you want to either set up GitHub pages or you could deploy the app either via Heroku or any other hosting platform. You can check to see if you're deployed correctly. If you go to your hostname / SMART on FHIR tutorial, you should be able to see the tutorial now hosted on your site. Now you want to go to the Cerner code console. You're going to have to register and it is free. Once you're on the Cerner code console, you want to click New App. I already created an app, so let's review it. We can then start editing the details. So you're going to want to give your app a name. You also want to give the Smart Launch URI. And this URI is what your app will utilize to authenticate against via the Cerner Sandbox OAuth server. Once your app is authorized, you will then have to tell where to redirect to your main app. So in this case, we'll be redirecting to the example Smart app. Next, this is a provider-facing app, so you want to select Provider. The FHIR spec that we'll be using for this tutorial is DSTU2, and this will be authorized via OAuth2. Now here showcases one of the main advantages of using SMART on FHIR. This allows health systems to limit apps from accessing data that is not intended for them to use. In this case, we're only going to need to be utilizing the observation and patient resources. So now you want to click Save. So after you click Save, you want to go back to your test app and retrieve the client ID that they provided. This client ID will now be updated in your launch.html file. So after you updated your launch.html file with your new client ID, you can now click on Begin Testing. You'll be prompted with the patient context that you want to view the app with. Here's a username and password that's generic for your portal sign-in. So now you can see this is basically a really simple app that kind of pulls in the patient resources. It pulls in their first name, their gender, and the date of birth, some basic demographic information, but it also pulls in the FHIR observation resources such as height, blood pressure, and some lab results as well. Now let's see one of the main advantages of Smart on FHIR in action. The next step is that we're going to run our app on another simulated EHR. In this case, we'll be using the Smart on FHIR sandbox. This showcases how Smart on FHIR can help aid in interoperability because we won't change any of our app's code, we will just use a different launch file. Now go to the launch.smarthealthit.org website. You should now be familiar with the launch options. Select Provider Launch, and the FHIR version that we'll be using is DSTU2. The patient and provider fields are optional. If you do not fill them out now, you'll be prompted to select them when you launch your app. Or you could go ahead and you could select the patient and provider context that you want to launch the app with. While you're selecting your patient, I invite you to explore the patient browser and review some of the different types of FHIR resources that some of the patients have. Try and search for different patients as some of them have different types of resources, and you could also search by conditions. So now back to configuring our launcher. Next, you want to put your launch URL within the field. In this case, we'll be using the launch smart sandbox.html file. For this sandbox version, you actually don't need a client ID as it's not validated in the test server. Once you're done, click Launch App to simulate launching the app from the EHR. The simulated EHR is represented by the gray border, and your app is now displayed within it. This showcases how the same app we used with the Cerner sandbox can be used to retrieve resources from a completely different FHIR server. And we also didn't have to change any of the code for data querying. Let's review how the app is querying the FHIR resources. The client library allows us to make a FHIR API call for the given patient. We can pass in parameters using MongoDB-like document search parameters. In this case, we're looking for the resource type observation. And we are then specifying the different LOIN codes that correspond to blood pressure, height, and lab results for LDL and HDL. We can now easily search for an additional observational value. In this case, we will add the search parameter for weight. This is done by adding the LOIN code for weight in the search field. Now we will have access to the weight observational value within our app to display to the end user. Resource handling is also important as the data is not always cleaned. This app implements the getQuantityValue and unit function. It checks the past observational value to see if either the value or unit fields are undefined, and it returns undefined if either of these parameters are not present. If both the unit and value parameters are present, it will then return the corresponding values so that it can be used within the app. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial about getting started with Smart on FHIR, and here are some helpful links below.